Right. Let's settle something once and for all. The British are not known for flashy food. They're not the ones winning global cuisine competitions or trending on food social media every other week. But here's what nobody talks about. The British kitchen is absolutely packed with practical, clever, almost annoyingly effective cooking tricks that have been quietly passed down through generations, and once you learn them, you genuinely cannot believe you've been cooking without them. Today we're counting down 31 of the most useful British cooking hacks you'll wish you knew years ago. Plus, there's a bonus at the end that might just change the way you use your oven forever. Let's get into it. Number 31. Use a wet knife to cut meringue cleanly. British people make a lot of meringue, pavlovas especially, and anyone who's tried to slice through one knows the disaster that follows. The shell shatters, the cream goes everywhere, and you end up with a pile of rubble on a plate. The British trick is to run your knife under cold water and leave it slightly wet before each cut. Don't dry it. The thin water film prevents the fragile meringue from gripping the blade, which is exactly what causes it to crack. Make one smooth downward press rather than a sawing motion and rinse the knife again between every single slice. The cold temperature also helps because it keeps the whipped cream from smearing. Number 30. Rest your pie in a cold pan before baking. This one comes straight from British pastry tradition. Before you put a short crust pastry pie into the oven, place the assembled pie tin on a cold baking sheet that's been sitting in the fridge for about 10 minutes. The sudden contrast between the cold base and the hot oven causes the bottom pastry to set faster, preventing the dreaded soggy bottom. British bakers have known this trick for decades, and it's why traditional British pies hold their structure so much better than you'd expect. The cold metal sheet also acts as a thermal buffer, distributing heat more evenly so the base cooks through properly. Number 29. Add a splash of malt vinegar to your chip oil. When British people make chips, which Americans would call thick-cut fries, they sometimes add just a teaspoon of malt vinegar directly into the oil before frying. This sounds counterintuitive because vinegar has water content, but at high temperatures that water flash evaporates, and the acetic acid helps maintain a slightly lower surface tension on the potato exterior. The result is a crispier outer layer that develops faster. You use very little, just enough to affect the surface chemistry without causing dangerous splattering. The traditional British chip shop flavour also starts from the inside out when you use this method. Number 28. Butter your bread before toasting it, not after. Before. British people, particularly older generations, developed this habit for practical reasons. When you spread cold butter on hot toast, it tears the bread, melts unevenly, and pools in the center. But when you apply a thin layer of softened butter to the bread before it goes into the toaster or under the grill, something different happens. The butter partially melts into the bread as it toasts, creating a richer, more evenly distributed flavor throughout the slice rather than sitting on top. Use a thin layer so the butter doesn't drip into the toaster mechanism, and make sure it's genuinely softened, not melted. Number 27. Use cold water in your Yorkshire pudding batter. Yorkshire pudding is arguably Britain's greatest contribution to cooking science. The standard recipe most people know uses room temperature ingredients, but the British trick for getting truly dramatic rise is to use ice-cold water or a combination of cold water and cold milk instead of all milk at room temperature. The extreme temperature contrast between the ice-cold batter hitting a smoking hot oiled tin causes a more violent initial steam explosion. This aggressive early rise is what creates those spectacular hollow crowns rather than flat, dense discs. Mix your batter ahead of time and rest it in the fridge for at least an hour before cooking. Number 26. Store your cheese wrapped in wax paper, not cling film. British people, particularly those who take their cheese seriously, refuse to use plastic wrap on cheese. The reason is straightforward. Cheese is a living product with ongoing bacterial and enzymatic activity. Plastic wrap suffocates it, traps moisture unevenly, and accelerates the development of off flavors. Wax paper, however, allows the cheese to breathe while still protecting it from drying out completely. Wrap it snugly in wax paper first, then loosely in foil as a second layer if you want extra protection. This keeps hard cheeses like cheddar properly textured for significantly longer without that sweaty, ammonia-like smell you get from plastic storage. Number 25. Brine your roast chicken in black tea. This is a genuinely underused British trick. Strong black tea, particularly a robust breakfast blend, contains tannins that work brilliantly as a brining agent. Make a pot of very strong tea, dissolve salt and a little sugar into it while it's hot. Let it cool completely, then submerge your chicken for 4 to 6 hours in the fridge. The tannins help break down surface proteins. The salt draws moisture in and then redistributes it throughout the meat, and the tea itself imparts a very subtle earthy depth that complements roast chicken beautifully. British people have been using tea in unexpected ways for centuries, and this is one of the most useful applications. Number 24. Use a metal spoon dipped in boiling water to scoop ice cream. British people often serve ice cream at home without a proper American-style ice cream scoop, so they improvise brilliantly. A large metal dessert spoon briefly dipped in just boiled water and then shaken dry creates a warm surface that glides through frozen ice cream far more effectively than any dedicated tool. The heat transfers to the ice cream surface, creating just enough melting to form a clean, smooth scoop. Dip and shake the spoon again between each portion. This method also works for very dense frozen desserts like semi-freddo that would defeat most scoops. Number 23. Grate frozen butter for pastry. British bakers figured out a long time ago that the hardest part of making good short crust pastry is keeping the fat cold enough to create proper flakiness. The solution is elegant. Take a stick of butter, wrap it and freeze it for 30 minutes, then grate it directly into your flour on a box grater. The grated pieces are small enough to distribute evenly through the flour without any hand contact that would warm them, and the texture of the final pastry is noticeably shorter and flakier. Work quickly after grating, add your cold water, and handle the dough as little as possible. This technique is now used by professional pastry chefs, but British home bakers were doing it decades before it became trendy. Number 22. Season your cast iron with lard, not vegetable oil. While Americans often reach for vegetable oil or Crisco to season cast iron, British people historically used lard, which is rendered pork fat. Lard has a much higher saturated fat content, which means it polymerizes more completely and evenly during the seasoning process. It creates a more durable, more naturally non-stick coating that doesn't flake or turn sticky over time the way some plant-based oils can. Apply a very thin layer, wipe away almost all of it so barely anything remains, then heat the pan upside down in an oven at 375 degrees Fahrenheit for an hour. Repeat this 3 or 4 times for an excellent base seasoning. Number 21. Add brown sauce to your gravy. British people use brown sauce, which is a tangy, slightly sweet condiment made from fruits, vegetables, and spices, in ways that go far beyond putting it on bacon sandwiches. Adding a tablespoon of brown sauce to a pan gravy after deglazing adds an extraordinary layer of complexity. The tamarind in brown sauce provides background acidity. The fruit sugars add body, and the spice blend deepens the overall flavor without tasting, like you added anything specific. Start with 1 tablespoon per 2 cups of gravy, taste, and adjust. You can find HP sauce, which is the most famous British brand, in many American grocery stores or online. It makes a remarkable difference to any roast meat gravy. Number 20. Cover your boiling potatoes with a tea towel at the end. This comes from an old British method for getting perfectly fluffy mashed or boiled potatoes. When your potatoes are just cooked through, drain them completely, return them to the pot, and then place a clean folded tea towel over the top before putting the lid back on. Let them sit off the heat for 5 minutes. The tea towel absorbs the excess steam that would otherwise condense on the lid and drip back down onto the potatoes, making them watery and dense. The result is potatoes that are significantly drier and fluffier, which means they absorb butter and cream more readily when you mash them. Number 19. Chill your salted butter in a ramekin of cold water. This sounds strange, but British people who grew up without consistent refrigeration developed the habit of using a French-style butter bell or simply storing butter in a ramekin submerged in cold salted water changed daily. The water creates an airtight seal that keeps the butter fresh at room temperature for up to a week without any rancidity. This means your butter is always perfectly spreadable without being melted. For Americans who hate the choice between rock-hard refrigerated butter and greasy melted butter, this is transformative. Use salted water on the outside and your butter stays fresh, soft, and at perfect spreading consistency every morning. Number 18. Blanch your bacon before using it in sauces or pies. British recipes for certain pies and pasta. Adjacent dishes often call for blanching streaky bacon or lardons in boiling water for 2 minutes before frying them. This process removes excess salt and some of the cured flavor, which prevents the bacon from dominating everything around it. When you then fry the blanched bacon, you get a cleaner pork flavor with better browning, and the sauce or filling it goes into becomes more balanced. This is particularly useful when making quiche, chicken, and bacon pies, or anything where the bacon is a supporting character rather than the main event. Number 17. Use stale bread to clarify stock. British frugality at its finest. When you have a cloudy stock or broth and want to clear it up without going through the complex raft method involving egg whites, British cooks sometimes add a thick slice of stale white bread to the simmering stock for 15 minutes. The bread absorbs suspended particles and some of the fat floating in the liquid. You then remove the bread and strain the stock through a fine cloth. It won't achieve a completely crystal clear consommé, but it noticeably improves the clarity and removes the slightly murky, greasy quality that homemade stock often has. This also works on soups where you want a cleaner, clearer broth. Number 16. Rest scrambled eggs off the heat earlier than you think. British scrambled eggs, done properly in the tradition of cooks like Delia Smith, are nothing like the rubbery American diner version. The key technique is removing the pan from the heat repeatedly during cooking and stirring constantly, and taking the eggs off the heat permanently when they still look underdone. They should appear just barely set, almost glossy, and slightly wetter than you'd want in the finished dish. The residual heat in the pan and in the eggs themselves continues cooking them to perfection in the 30 seconds it takes to plate them. Low heat throughout, constant gentle stirring, and early removal are the 3 pillars of this approach. Number 15. Put a bay leaf in your flour storage container. British pantries often feature dried bay leaves tucked into containers of flour, pasta, and dry goods. The natural oils in bay leaves act as a mild deterrent to flour weevils and other pantry insects. Bay has been used for this purpose for centuries across Europe, and British kitchens maintained the practice long after many others abandoned it. Simply drop 2 or 3 dried bay leaves into your flour container when you transfer flour from the bag. Replace them every few months. This is purely preventative and has no effect whatsoever on the flavor of whatever you bake, since the bay doesn't transfer any taste to dry flour. Number 14. Brush pastry with egg white only, not whole egg. British pastry chefs learned that whole egg wash, while creating a beautiful deep golden color, also tends to create a slightly leathery crust on delicate pastries. Using only the egg white mixed with a tiny pinch of salt and a few drops of water creates a thinner, more transparent glaze that gives a lighter shine without toughening the surface. This is particularly important on short crust pastry lids for pies and sausage rolls. The result is a crispier, more delicate finish that shatters slightly when you bite into it, rather than requiring you to bite through a tough, chewy skin. Number 13. Add a pinch of white pepper to cream sauces instead of black. British cooks have long understood that black pepper in a white or cream sauce creates visible specks that many people find visually unappealing, and that the flavor sits on top of the sauce rather than integrating into it. White pepper, made from the same plant but processed differently to remove the outer husk, has a sharper, more penetrating heat that blends invisibly into cream sauces and becomes part of the overall flavor rather than a separate element you notice individually. It's slightly hotter than black pepper, so use about 2/3 of the amount you'd normally use and add it early so it has time to mellow into the sauce. Number 12. Let your roast rest on a wire rack, not on the board. When British people roast meat, they often rest it elevated on a wire cooling racks, set inside a roasting tray rather than directly on a cutting board. The benefit is twofold. Air can circulate underneath the meat, meaning the bottom doesn't steam in its own juices and turn soft while the top remains crispy. And all the resting juices drip into the tray below rather than pooling under the meat, which means you can pour all those flavorful juices directly into your gravy without losing a drop. Rest large roasts for a minimum of 20 minutes this way, covering loosely with foil. Number 11. Add vinegar to your poaching water for eggs. This is a well-known trick that British people have been using for generations, but the specific type of vinegar matters more than people realize. White wine vinegar works better than regular white distilled vinegar because it has a gentler acidity that tightens the egg white proteins without making the finished egg taste acidic. Use 1 tablespoon per litre of barely simmering water, not boiling. The slight acidity encourages the egg white to coagulate quickly around the yolk, preventing those wispy, ghost-like trails of white that haunt badly poached eggs. Fresh eggs also work significantly better because the whites are tighter and less watery to begin with. Number 10. Freeze leftover wine in ice cube trays for cooking. British home cooks are extraordinarily frugal and waste-conscious, and the habit of freezing leftover wine in ice cube trays is widespread. Each cube is roughly 1 to 2 tablespoons of wine, perfectly portioned for adding to pan sauces, stews, and braises without having to open a fresh bottle. Red wine cubes are excellent in beef and lamb dishes. White wine cubes work beautifully in chicken sauces and risotto. The wine doesn't need to be great quality since cooking concentrates and transforms it anyway, making this an ideal use for wine that's slightly past its best for drinking. Label your trays because frozen red and white wine look remarkably similar. Number 9. Smear Marmite on meat before roasting. Marmite is a deeply polarizing, intensely savory yeast extract that British people spread on toast and apparently on everything else too. When you apply a very thin smear of Marmite mixed with a little olive oil across the surface of a roast before it goes in the oven, the glutamates in the Marmite dramatically amplify the savory umami depth of the meat. The high concentration of free glutamates acts similarly to a flavor amplifier, making the meat taste more intensely of itself. Use very little, perhaps half a teaspoon mixed with a tablespoon of oil for a whole chicken or a small joint of beef. You won't taste the Marmite specifically, but the roast will be significantly more savory and complex. Number 8. Use the pasta cooking water technique, but for custard. British custard, the poured kind made with egg yolks, milk, cream, and sugar, has a reputation for splitting and curdling at the worst moment. The British trick for rescuing a split custard is to immediately remove it from heat and add a tablespoon of cold water, then whisk vigorously. The cold water reduces the temperature quickly enough to halt the curdling process, and the mechanical action of whisking helps re-emulsify the mixture. If it's already split into visible curds, strain it through a fine sieve, add cold water, and blend it briefly with an immersion blender before straining again. This saves what would otherwise be a wasted batch. Number 7. Salt your cabbage before cooking, then rinse it. British people cook a lot of cabbage, and the generations who did it best knew that salting shredded cabbage and leaving it for 20 minutes before rinsing and cooking it produces a fundamentally different result. The salt draws out a significant amount of water from the cabbage cells, which means when it hits a hot pan, it doesn't steam itself into mush. Instead, it browns, caramelizes, and develops actual flavor. After salting, rinse thoroughly to remove excess salt, squeeze out the remaining water, then cook quickly in butter or fat over high heat. The difference between properly prepared cabbage cooked this way and the boiled-to-death version is extraordinary. Number 6. Make your own breadcrumbs from crust, saved in the freezer. British kitchen frugality again. Most British homes have a small bag in the freezer specifically for bread crusts and the ends of loaves that nobody wants to eat fresh. Once the bag is full, the contents go into a food processor and become homemade breadcrumbs that are frozen right back in their container. These are significantly better than store-bought dried breadcrumbs for coating fish or chicken because they still have moisture content that allows them to adhere without egg in some cases, and they toast to a golden, crunchy coating that's impossible to replicate from a cardboard canister. For extra flavor, add dried herbs or a grating of hard cheese before processing. Number 5. Use a damp cloth under your mixing bowl. This sounds almost insultingly simple, but British baking culture emphasized stability and control in a way that made this standard practice. Placing a damp kitchen cloth under your mixing bowl stops it from sliding around the counter while you whisk or stir, freeing one hand entirely. This matters more than it sounds when you're making something like hollandaise or a custard that requires continuous whisking and simultaneous addition of liquid. The cloth conforms to the bowl's base and creates enough friction that even vigorous whisking won't send the bowl skidding. It's one of those things that once you start doing it, you never stop. Number 4. Rest scones upside down in the oven for the last 2 minutes. British scones have a specific texture goal that's different from American biscuits. They should be even on top and bottom with a clean split in the middle where the layers separate naturally. The problem is the top often over-browns before the bottom is fully set. British bakers solve this by flipping their scones upside down for the final 2 minutes of baking. The residual heat crisps the base and finishes the interior while preventing any further browning on top. The scone holds its shape perfectly because by the time you flip it, the structure is already set. This gives you an even, beautifully coloured scone with a crisp base rather than a pale, soft bottom. Number 3. Use custard powder instead of flour to thicken fruit fillings. British custard powder, which is primarily cornstarch with vanilla flavouring and yellow colouring, works better than plain flour as a thickener in fruit pies and crumbles because it creates a clearer, glossier sauce that showcases the fruit colour rather than muddying it. It also has a slightly lower thickening temperature than flour, so it starts working sooner and more evenly. Use about 2 teaspoons of custard powder per cup of fruit in your filling, mixed first with a little cold water or the fruit's own juice before combining with everything else. The vanilla notes from the custard powder also complement almost every fruit you'd use in a pie or crumble. Number 2. Add a cold butter cube at the very end of every sauce. This technique is known in French cooking as monter au beurre, but British cooks use it practically and consistently across everything from gravies to pan sauces to vegetable glazes. When your sauce is finished and you've already adjusted the seasoning, remove the pan from heat and add 1 or 2 small cubes of very cold butter, swirling the pan gently rather than stirring. The cold butter emulsifies into the sauce as it melts, adding a glossy sheen, a silky mouthfeel, and a subtle richness that makes the sauce taste finished and restaurant quality. If the pan is too hot, the butter will break and become greasy, so always remove from heat first. Number 1. Use boiling water from the kettle to start cooking. This is perhaps the most significant single habit that separates British cooking efficiency from most other home kitchen approaches. British people always boil water in an electric kettle first before it goes into the pot. This sounds obvious, but the implications are profound. When you pour already boiling water into a pot and start it on the stove, you eliminate the time wasted bringing cold tap water to a boil on the burner, which can take 5 to 8 minutes on a standard American stovetop. For pasta, vegetables, blanching, stocks, and soups, this means you're cooking in genuinely boiling water almost immediately rather than in gradually heating water that's not doing the job properly yet. The electric kettle is standard in every British kitchen, and for Americans who don't own one, this single appliance might be the most immediately impactful kitchen tool you're missing. Now the bonus, as promised. This is genuinely one of the most clever kitchen tricks in British cooking, and it comes from the tradition of British baking. When you want to test if your oil is hot enough for frying without a thermometer, British cooks drop a small wooden skewer straight down into the oil. If fine bubbles immediately and continuously stream from the very tip of the wood when it touches the bottom of the pan, the oil is at roughly 350 degrees Fahrenheit, the sweet spot for most frying. If there are no bubbles, it's too cold. If the bubbles are violent and large, it's too hot. The wood doesn't burn at frying temperatures, and the bubbles are caused by residual moisture in the wood reacting to the heat, giving you a remarkably accurate visual thermometer that costs nothing and requires no batteries. British chip shops and home fryers have been using this instinctively for generations, and once you know it, you'll never go back to guessing.